And welcome everybody to our 160th episode of the Minnesota Outdoor Skills and Stewardship Series. My name is Benji Cohn, and I'd like to welcome Melissa Wagner she's one of our fisheries supervisors down in the Lanesboro office. You can talk a little bit about a really cool project. I love fishing for brook trout. It's one of my favorite, just a beautiful species of fish. I love to get out and fish for them. And this is a really cool project that's been going on for a few years now. And Melissa, I'll turn it over to you and let you introduce everybody to yourself and the project we're working on.
Sounds great. Thanks, Benji, and thanks everybody for joining us today. I am very excited to talk about our Southeast brook trout management down here in Lanesboro. So yeah, to start out, a little bit about me. I grew up in Oakdale, east side of St. Paul, and I was fortunate enough to have a family cabin where I learned to fish on lakes and realized I love fishing and anything to do with water. Went to the University of St. Thomas for my undergraduate degree and proceeded then into NDSU for my master's degree. And then shortly after, I was able to get a job with the DNR fisheries down here in Lanesboro in 2007 and got to do a lot of fun things like electrofishing seen here in this picture. Got to handle a lot of really nice big trout. And then I took another job with the DNR fisheries where I was wearing a little bit different hat and worked on our stream habitat improvement projects, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit later, but coordinating mostly with Trout Unlimited on those. And then recently moved back into the Lanesboro office as the area fisheries supervisor. So I now get to handle some nice big trout again, which I love. A little bit about the area that we're in, if you're not familiar with Southeast Minnesota, it is called the Driftless area. It encompasses the corner of Southeast Minnesota, as well as portions of Southwest Wisconsin, Northeast Iowa, and Northwest Illinois. And the reason it's called the Driftless is the glacial events that happened many, many years past, and there was a few of them. They did not recede through this area, and so we don't have the scour like we see in most of the rest of Minnesota, where we have potholes and lakes and some more flatter terrain. So instead we have what we call bluffs. So you can see these limestone bluffs, which make ways to valleys, and we have no natural lakes down here. So if you do come down here and you see we do have some ponds and reservoirs, but those are simply either dammed streams or rivers. So no natural lakes. We have thousands and thousands of springs in our area. So this is the cold water seeps that come out of our bluffs. The bluffs in this limestone material have a lot of cracks and holes. So the cold water flows through them and out eventually. And this spring water is typically coming out of those bluffs at about 48 degrees Fahrenheit, which means they're cooler in the summer and warmer in the winter. So if you're driving around in our area and you see a stream that's open, you know it's a pretty good trout stream because it will not freeze over in the wintertime. So a lot of those springs have led to what we have now down in our area, over 800 miles of designated trout streams. And those are where our trout species live. So we have 3 trout species here in our area. The top one is a rainbow trout. Those were originally brought over from the West Coast and stocked in our area. We have in the middle here is the brown trout, and those were brought over from Germany. And on the bottom is the brook trout. And what's unique about brook trout is that's the only native salmonid, and salmonid being the trout species in Southeast Minnesota. So again, the brown trout and rainbows were both stocked from elsewhere, but they also do very well in our area. So brook trout are a cold water fish that prefers, really cold water, which is typically those smaller spring-fed streams, often found in the headwaters of our watersheds, so kind of the further upland portions of of a stream watershed. You know, liking the cold water, that's what they need to live. So they do have a lethal temperature around 76 degrees. Once you get up to about 68, they start getting stressed. So their preference is, you know, below kind of that 70-degree range. And so that kind of limits the streams that they can survive in. They are fall spawners along with the brown trout. And so they do well in our area, but they also get really colored up in the fall. So this picture was last fall. They get a little bit darker colors, more vibrant colors in the fall when they're getting ready to do their spawning thing. And then the average life is actually 3 to 4 years. We were just kind of chatting in our office about, you know, average size. You know, if you get a brook trout over 10 inches, that's a pretty good brook trout for our area and in a stream. A little bit about the brook trout stocking history. Trout were first stocked in southeast Minnesota in 1878, and that was really to replenish the extirpated brook trout. Extirpated meaning you could have a loss of a population in a stream. And that was brought on by, you know, poor land use practices, which degrades the stream habitat, as well as some exploitation. So overfishing, they were lost in some of our streams. So they were also stocking rainbows and brown trout during those times. And many of those brook trout stockings were eventually successful, but some did require multiple efforts through time. So this graph is the history of our brook trout fingerling stocking. And when I talk about fingerlings, so these are trout that are about the size of your finger. So they're stocked before they're even 1 year old. And down here, this is the graph showing the history starting in 1925, going through this year. And I guess what I just really wanted to show you is there's, you know, these different efforts that have gone on through time, these pulses in stocking. And these are all of our streams compiled into one annual, you know, stocking total. So these might be different streams or different efforts that have gone on through time. You can see there's a gap here in 2015 to 2023, and it's not that there's data missing, but I'll get into why there's that gap there. But here's where we are today. We have a really exciting time that we have a new strain of brook trout that we're going to be, or that we are stocking already. So, and that's kind of what I wanted to talk about today and how we as managers are making decisions on where to stock those. So back in 2004, again, you know, we know brook trout are a native species to our area, but some of our researchers asked, do we have native brook trout left in some of these stream populations? So again, we know there's been a history dating back to the 1800s of there's been stocking, and many of those strains were brought over from the East Coast, where brook trout are also successful. And so the question was, do we have any of our native brook trout remaining, or ones that have, you know, lived here forever? And so a study started in 2005 where we basically went around to every stream that we thought could support brook trout, or ones where we knew brook trout were. And we collected samples from them. So we first, you know, we sampled to see if there were brook trout there. And then if we found brook trout, we basically collected a tissue sample from them, which is simply a fin clip, and we had it analyzed for genetics. So the summary was we found that 68% of those 174 streams had brook trout, which is a great number. So, you know, they're doing well in our area. This is a good time, and it shows that we should be managing for them if they can survive in that many of those streams. Compared to there was only 3% in the 1970s. And you might ask why the difference. We're in really good times right now. Our spring flows are high. Our improvements to land use have been successful to help promote better water quality in our area. While there's still Still could be some improvements. This just shows that we are in some pretty good times for trout management. So getting back to the results, we had those 74 streams where we tested the genetics of those brook trout. And in order to determine if they're a native trout, we don't have any leftover tissue samples from really, really old trout, but what we do have is samples from hatchery sources. So what we were able to do is combine all the streams and all the hatchery sources, and this is like a hairy, scary graph that everybody's wondering what in the world this is, but I'll explain it here. Each line is either a stream or a strain of stocked fish. In this case, the ones with the yellow circles are the ones where it's a hatchery strain that has been previously stocked in our area. So you could see there's 6 different strains we've used. And then all of these branches are showing that they're genetically related to one another. So any main branches off of this middle portion of the graph is showing these are genetically related. So all these lines in red are streams that we believe are genetically related to a stocked strain. On the flip side, these blue lines are streams that are not related to those stocked strains. So we believe that these are streams with the remnant driftless area genetics. And if you're familiar with the area, the different yellow circles, those are 3 different watersheds where those streams reside, which makes sense because you have some genetic, shifting within those individual watersheds. So we have, again, almost half of them are found to have those native, or what I'll also refer to as heritage genetics. You might be asking what that those green lines were. Well, the last strain that we had that we were previously using to stock our streams was called the Minnesota Wild strain of brook trout. And those are where those streams fell out. When that population was developed, we used 2 streams to collect adults and ultimately create this Minnesota Wild strain. And the 2 streams that were used, one was Coleridge Creek, which falls over here in the heritage genetics portion of the graph. And then we have the Spring Brook. So we kind of say they got it half right because the Spring Brook population actually ended up being more genetically related to the hatchery strains. So it's good, kind of a good check here that they do all fall out together, separate from, the blue lines. So those are the results. This is what that looks on a map. So this is the map of Southeast Minnesota. And the blue lines are what we call designated trout streams. So these are all waters that we believe can support and most likely have brook trout, or sorry, any trout in them. So they're designated trout water. The dots are where we have sampled for brook trout. The gray dots meaning we did not find any brook trout. The green ones are where we found the heritage or the native genetics of brook trout that remain. The yellow dot is where we found our Minnesota Wild, so we knew where we had been stocking them, but it was interesting because sometimes we found that they had moved. So we're finding some Minnesota Wild in places where we hadn't stocked them. And then the red is would be the hatchery strains that we found. So pretty good mix of all of them. And so with those results, we kind of knew what we had down here. We had some heritage populations still remaining, which was really exciting. We still had the Minnesota Wild strain of fish at one of our hatcheries, but in 2015, there was a pretty major flood event in the watershed with that hatchery. And due to floodwaters inundating the hatchery and ultimately the hatchery having, those floodwaters bringing in some disease to those fish, we had to depopulate the Minnesota wild strain. And in other words, we had to get rid of those fish from the hatchery. And, it was too bad because those fish were doing really well in many of our streams, and we'd been using them for quite a few years. But we then took advantage of this opportunity, and the quest to create a new brook trout strain had started. So our first steps were to, look at all the heritage, the streams that we have with these heritage genetics, and identify potential donor streams. And what I mean by that is, you need to make sure you have enough adults that are of reproductive age to take eggs and milk from. And so we kind of had to identify populations that had enough adults to bring in enough genetics into our new strain. We also had to do a lot of sampling for disease in those streams because we couldn't bring any diseased fish or material into the hatchery. Once those were identified, we did wild egg takes stream side, which is a picture up here in the upper right. There's a picture of, you could see some little trout eggs down in the bowl, and this is the milk that's being placed on top of them to fertilize them in the field. And then those fertilized eggs are then brought into the hatchery. So in 2020, we created the first Minnesota Driftless strain of broodstock. And so your first goal is to build up these adults in your hatchery that you will then spawn in the hatchery to create the fish you ultimately stock. So the broodstock are like the adults that are housed at the hatchery. And so that was the year we first created the Minnesota Driftless, which is what this strain is being called. These are located at the Peterson Hatchery, which is shown here. They have some kind of neat domes outside where those broodstock are being kept. And then this last summer was a pretty historical year where we stocked the first fingerlings of those Minnesota Driftless. And kind of why everything's kind of ramped up in how we're so excited about this project, because as you talk back or look back, we started this back in 2004 was the first question. So almost 20 years in the making of asking, do we have heritage genetics, finding out we do, and now we have a strain of brook trout that are created from those remnant genetics. So here's a quick look at the inside of the Peterson hatchery where the actual fingerlings are. They're in these kind of round tubs. And we just did a little kind of Facebook blurb. It's on YouTube still. If you Google YouTube stocking the driftless strain of brook trout, there's kind of a quick little video about the 2023 debut of these fingerlings that the DNR put out. So then, now that we have these fish available to us as managers, we kind of have to decide, how are we going to manage the heritage brook trout in our area? So including the ones that have the heritage genetics remaining. So I kind of have these 3 bullet points: protection, enhancement, and restoration. So protection, being that streams are long and linear and often flowing through private ownership, we do have the ability to acquire land along them for protection, minimize the amount of development or disturbance that occurs along them. And then we also have the ability to acquire easements, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit throughout this presentation. But basically an easement is a right for anglers to access the stream for angling, but what it also does is allows us as managers to manage that easement along the stream. And typically our easements are 66 feet from the center of the stream going out to either the right or left bank. And so roughly about 50 feet of the bank, we have the ability to maintain and manage for either vegetation or you know, reducing erosion and other things, which kind of gets into the enhancement portion. So we do what we call stream habitat improvement projects. So in order to enhance a stream, we can go along there and do a project, and we can target it specifically for habitat that we know brook trout prefer, which is what we're starting to do more recently. Another way to enhance brook trout population is to stock the new Minnesota Driftless strain. And that's also a way where we can restore a population into a stream where maybe they've been lost. You can envision back in the day when if there was poor water quality or land use and we lost a population in a small brook trout stream, you know, their ability to find their way to navigate through other warmer water to find their way back to that cold water might be very challenging. So we do have the ability to actively restore them back to that stream by stocking. Going to kind of now run through some examples of each of those. So here's the protection idea. And so again, the blue lines are our designated trout streams. The green dots are where we have these heritage genetics remaining. And then the yellow shapes are, you know, state land, in this case, the WMA or Wildlife Management Area, but still owned by the state and able to protect those lands along those streams. And so we do have the ability where we could potentially purchase additional land next to those, or, you know, possibly move over to another stream that also has those heritage genetics. This is an example of a stream that we have no protection either with state land or easements, and it's a case where we could approach landowners and try to purchase an easement along that stream, not only to increase angling opportunities for anglers, but also it creates those opportunities for protection and enhancement for us as managers. This is what those stream easement signs will look like if you're down in our area or other areas of the state. We have signs that show there's an easement there. You might also see these stiles or these ladders that go up and over landowners' fences. And those are perpetual. So when the state purchases those, they're forever. So we'll forever have angling easement along that stream and the ability to do management. Just an example of an enhancement project. So this was a habitat improvement project we did on a brook trout stream. You could see this picture on the left is the before, picture on the right is after. A lot of our goals in these projects are to reduce this bank from collapsing into the stream. And we also will add habitat. So there's some root wads and trees that are buried down in here to create some hiding spots for those fish. And then they're just making them, you know, this can weather a flood better than this could without creating additional erosion. So the last portion of the enhancement and restoration portion is the stocking of the Minnesota Driftless brook trout. And that's kind of also one of our main goals now that we have them available to us. But some more decisions to be made about where. So we have, again, over 800 miles of streams, maybe not all of them, you know, brook trout would do well in. So we need to kind of identify which streams we should be stocking them in. Another thing that we need to initially look at is what we called stream connectivity. So kind of the idea that some of these waters are connected to others. So we don't want to be stocking this new strain where we already have a heritage population maybe next door, like the next stream downstream, there's a stream that has the heritage, because eventually they could maybe mix, and we don't really want to be doing that. So some of our goals to start are going to be to stock direct tribs to the Mississippi. So we have some really nice brook trout streams along the Mississippi, really cold water, and the idea that they'll probably stay just in that stream and not migrate into the Mississippi and do well finding their way into a different stream. Another option is we can stock an entire watershed. So we do have quite a few watersheds where there's no heritage brook trout found. So we could go into a watershed and try to stock them in all the places we think they do well and basically restore that entire watershed with these new brook trout. Then we have, the question of public access versus where we think they'll be more successful. So obviously public access, a lot of our stocking efforts are to increase opportunities for anglers. But we also have some streams, again, like that one I showed previously, where we don't have any access, but there might be a really good cold water stream that, for whatever reason, doesn't have brook trout in that we'd like to restore. So we are looking at a couple places where we're just wanting to restore those native trout species. And then we have these four, current brook trout populations. So the different examples of the streams that have the heritage. And obviously, like I mentioned already, we're not going to want to stock on top of those. And then we have our streams with the Minnesota wild strain. And then we have the Eastern hatchery strain streams. And then again, we have some streams that have no brook trout, but they might be able to support them. So I'm going to kind of run through, some of those approaches now. So here's the watershed stocking approach. The orange is what they call like a major watershed. All these are flowing eventually to the Mississippi is over here on the right. But you don't see any green dots in any of these three streams that shows that there's no heritage that we found, that there's no heritage brook trout remaining in these watersheds. So this is a case where you could go and identify places where we think they would do well and start stocking those native genetics back into those watersheds. So again, we have the four different stream types to stock: none, Minnesota wild strain, the hatchery strain, and then the heritage strain. And I'm going to run through kind of some examples of the, where we might stock and where we might not. Initially, we're not going to stock on top of those heritage populations. But this is an example of a stream that we might have where we had previously stocked the Minnesota wild strain, which, as I mentioned earlier, did really well in some streams. So as you can see here, the example that we have a lot of adults that are doing really well, growing big, and they're obviously reproducing because you see a lot of young, small trout. And so this is a case where we would probably just leave it alone. It's doing well. We don't really need to be stocking any more additional fish, and we can move efforts elsewhere. This is a different example of a stream that maybe we had previously stocked Minnesota wild fish into. They're growing, doing well, but maybe they're just kind of reaching the end of their life of the ones that we had stocked. We don't see any natural reproduction or survival. And so that might be a case where we would want to go in and stock. Another scenario is we have the Eastern hatchery strain, and there's a few adults in there, there's a few young ones, they're doing okay. But our thought is maybe we stock the Minnesota Driftless strain on top of these hatchery strains, and then we can see how or if they outcompete the hatchery strain. And that's something we're actually going to be looking at a couple of the streams that we're stocking, where we're going to be mixing them and see who does better than who. And then we have the last scenario of there's no brook trout. We as managers don't really want to just go through all the effort of raising these fish and then just dump them in wherever we hope they'll do good. So we're actually collecting data to confirm that they will survive where they aren't currently. So here on the upper right is what we call a water temperature logger. And so we can place these in the stream, and we've chosen to place them June 1st through the end of September because those are typically the warmest months in our area. And we can track the water temperature on a daily basis. And then we put it on this kind of neat little graph that shows us, are you in the range of survivability for brook trout. So this is a example here that shows that they are. So that helps our confidence in that, you know, the waters that we're putting them into, they will be able to survive. So this is where we've stocked last summer. It's the same map you guys saw earlier. What I want you to focus on now is the dark black folded circles. And those are the places where we stocked last year, and we will continue for the next couple years. You know, we want to stock a couple different year classes so that they have the opportunity to grow and hopefully reproduce on their own. So you can see here that we have some that have the gray where we had no brook trout previously. So we stocked some of those. We also have the yellow where we had the Minnesota wild. And, you know, we had to stop stocking those in 2015, obviously, because we lost that population. So we kind of started up efforts again there where some of them were just barely hanging on. And we wanted to kind of help bolster those and see if this new strain will do better. And then the red are those cases where we have this East Coast hatchery strains, and we're going to stock on top of those and ultimately see which one does better. So quickly go kind of through a summary of some of our goals and commonly asked questions before you guys have a chance to ask any questions. Again, one of our main goals is to protect, now that we know that we have streams with heritage brook trout in them, we can protect those populations. We also want to continue to reestablish brook trout populations, whether it's through the stocking of on top of already known populations, as well as identifying places where we can, you know, reintroduce brook trout where there aren't any currently. Another goal is to increase angling opportunities for brook trout. So finding more streams that they can be successful and stocking them where we can have multiple year classes, so more opportunities to grow more big trout. I love this picture. I found it when I was putting this presentation together. This is Dushy Creek, which if you're not familiar with the area, this is the stream that runs right by our office here in Lanesboro. And you can see, I don't know, these guys are probably having a good time here fishing all together, but we also want to create opportunities such as this. So the more populations we can get established, the more chance anglers can have opportunities fishing for brook trout in scenarios like this. So some commonly asked questions, will the Minnesota Driftless brook trout do better? It's kind of something I alluded to, that we do have plans to, you know, try to figure that out. But basically our confidence in this strain is based on the fact that these populations and genetics have survived this long, and specifically in this driftless area, which is a unique environment. We think they will do good in this area. Another question we're receiving is, where will the Minnesota Driftless brook trout be stocked? It's not, I know other states post where they stock fish. We do not. It changes annually, and so my best suggestion for this would be to just contact your local area office if you're curious, you know, where any trout are being stocked. We also, you know, stock catchable size rainbows that we get often asked where those opportunities are. So feel free to contact us anytime. When can I catch a Minnesota Driftless brook trout? So obviously we, you know, as I said earlier, we have 74 streams that already have brook trout in them, but people are, you know, excited about this new strain and when they might be able to catch them. Last summer, they were stocked as fingerlings, as I mentioned, which they're the size of your finger. These are my hand, this is my hand here. And so in order to get to a catchable size adult, that'd take at least a couple years. So, 2025 would be probably the first opportunity to catch one of those Minnesota driftless trout. I'm gonna quick kind of go through some tips for angling now that you guys are all excited about seeing all these fish pictures, and we had the opener last weekend. Hopefully some of you are itching to get down to Lanesboro and do some fishing. So kind of some friendly reminders. We do have different regulations on some of our streams. So understanding the season, it's already open now, but as the season goes on, understanding the season and the harvest dates. So it's open for harvest now. Make sure you have not only your fishing license, but in order to fish in a trout stream as well as keep trout, you need a trout stamp. Again, there's different regulations on different streams. So the general regulation in our area on streams is 5 trout. Only one can be over 16 inches. But we do have some streams that have bait restrictions as well as slot limits. And how would you find an easement? You can do a little recon even before you come down here. There's some online tools on the DNR website. If you simply go to MN DNR, you can either search trout fishing or stream finder. I tried both of them today. They work. It'll bring you ultimately to this page. There's other areas or regions of the state down here. You would then click on one of those for the area that you want to be fishing. Here's when you click on Southeast Minnesota, and then you have the option to kind of look in the map view, or you can search for a particular stream if you want. Once you click on map view and scroll around, this is kind of what you'll be looking at. So you can kind of identify a stream. The red ones will be ones that have a special regulation on them. Otherwise, I believe they were looking blue. And once you zoom in a little further, you'll see where the easements are. So in this case here, they're pink, but you can't really see that until you zoom further in. So just kind of tip that you might not think there's any easements on a stream until you zoom in a little bit further. We also do have a hard copy angling book. I love this book. I use it as my back road map guide, even just for navigating around down here. We have one for the southern and central Minnesota, as well as for northeast. And this is a snippet of a page on the right. And colors change differently from online. But if there's a color other than blue on the stream, that means that there's a regulation, a special regulation on it. And then in this case, the fishing easements are shown here in gray. And so you could see here there's a road, and commonly people are accessing these easements at bridge access points, where again we would have those easement signs. Most of the area offices have these, but if you do not have access to get to one of those, you can call the info center and they'll mail you a copy. Last kind of plug for a product we have online. It's on the Lanesboro DNR page. So if you go back to DNR and search Lanesboro area fisheries, we have what we call a stream conditions page. And we try to update this, especially after any rain events. We don't want anglers traveling down here to come stay in this lovely camper and to find this kind of condition. So we want to try to help people planning their trips down here. And I also just urge anybody that is interested in coming down to the area, especially if you're not familiar with what streams might be good to fish, feel free to give us a call anytime, send me an email. We really like to help promote the fishing and help out anglers in our area. And with that, I just want to thank everybody for joining me today, and I'm appreciative of the opportunity to share this exciting project that I'm a part of.
Remember to unmute myself there. Melissa, great job. Thanks. And thanks for pointing out that map. one of the favorite spots to take my kids is at Buck Snort, so I might have to
Yeah.
change strategies now. I don't know, but it's cool. It's a cool little area down there for sure. So
Yeah. Yep.
I was just right when you're finishing up there, I was just putting a link in there. I did put a few links in the chat for the stream conditions. I just put in there. You just mentioned at the end of the presentation there. Jeff threw it in there for the regs and the translated regs and stream finders in there. So if you are looking for any of those references that Melissa referenced during her presentation, you're more than welcome to go to the chat function and grab those. So, and if you're watching this recorded afterwards, you'll have to get them off the presentation there. So we have quite a few questions streaming in, and it amazes me when we do these presentations and we talk about it, and I'm a little bit of a history buff, and when I talk to kids and I'm like, we're always learning stuff. We're always doing better. And, from the turn of the century when we used to load up a bunch of rainbow trout from out east someplace and throw them off the train into streams that we think would work, to now we're doing this genetic research and doing just a fantastic job of getting this information out there, both to the public and just improving our fisheries and stuff. So kudos to you and our whole fisheries team down there in Lanesboro and all across the state, honestly, to keep up and do all the good work we're doing. So
yeah, thanks.
John had a great question. We had a couple of questions about this. Do brown and rainbow trout impede brook trout reintroduction? Are those species also stocked in the same streams?
That is a good question, and it's something we're wrestling with a little bit. We do have a couple streams where we had currently stocking brown trout, but we also think they'd be great candidates for the brook trout, and so we're needing to, kind of adjust some of our management thinking. Many times there's opportunities to still stock brown trout further downstream. Again, these brook trout really prefer the cold water, which is typically up in the headwaters of, or the further upstream portion of the stream, but it's not always the case because sometimes we have really big springs that might only enter the stream halfway down. But and some of the couple examples I can think of are coming to my mind that we have stocked these brook trout. Our goals are to just shift, reduce the number of browns we're stocking, but as well shift them further downstream. If we have the stream I'm thinking of in my mind is like 8 miles long, so there's a lot of other stream length that brook trout would not do well further downstream. And there are cases as well that the browns, if they have other habitat that they'd prefer, they won't even go up into the upper portions where it's really cold. So they kind of have their thermal preference as well. And there is a little bit of overlap with the species, but there also can be some separation in the portions of stream where we can, try to provide opportunities for both species. The
Great, I'm sure.
rainbows, you kind of mentioned those. The rainbows are more used for, we stock them as like catchable size rainbows, more trying to increase opportunities in either very popular streams or in town fishing. So.
Great. Thanks for that, Bill. I think that answered Bill's question also. So if you want, Melissa, you can take your presentation down and give everybody a chance to copy your email and phone number down there if they do have any questions. William asked a couple of questions here, but in streams, when you're showing your map, in those streams that were marked as having none, where you didn't find any brook trout, is there still enough food for stockfish to survive?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there would be plenty of food in those cases. Again, we're checking for water temperatures, but also, as we're kind of walking around, making sure there's a good habitat. It's not just a silty, sandy, yucky looking stream where there wouldn't be any bugs hiding on all the rocks. So, and trout food can come in different, it doesn't always have to necessarily be, in a stream. You get a lot of the grasshoppers and other bugs that are flopping around that get eaten. But yeah, these upstream portions, there's usually not a lot of other fish species. Sometimes there's sculpin, which are another cold water species that we find brook trout really do well in concert with. But you know, it's not something we're sampling. It's hard to do everything. But our plan is to go back to many of the places, especially where there was no brook trout. Again, we're going to stock them for about 3 to 4 years, and then we're going to return to those streams maybe in 6 or 7 years and sample to see how they're doing. And with that, I think we'll learn a lot on the success of those cases where there weren't any previously.
Yeah, great. David had a question. Why were the early hatchery brood sources from the East Coast rather than more local strains?
I just think, I don't know, I wasn't around then, but I think it was what was available.
That's what I guess. We didn't,
Um,
when they started stocking around here, we were just had gotten to statehood. We didn't have facilities to
yeah, a
do
lot of
this.
our hatcheries used to be privately owned and then have been since acquired from the state, or acquired by the state.
Thomas was asking, in your sampling across southeast Minnesota, did you find any evidence of brook brown trout hybrids or tiger trout?
Yep, we do have tiger trout down here. So, and if there's a healthy population of brook trout and brown trout, we actually see quite a few of them. And we do have anglers that'll catch them. So yeah, that's kind of a unique cross. So it's a cross between a brook trout or brown trout. They're not able to reproduce, so, but we do see quite a few of those in our streams as well.
David had a question about easements, and this is one that comes up quite a bit. So this would be, David, refer to that link in the chat to, I believe it was episode 107 on easements that we talked about. But he's curious regarding the easements. Always being mindful of property rights. Thank you for that. When the map shows that there is an easement, but the property is posted as no trespassing, is the easement along the stream, or is it best to just not fish there? So.
Yeah, that is a good question. You know, we do have some of those issues where we've had people in the past, whether they're trespassing beyond the easement or whatever reason, the landowner has chosen to post the no trespassing signs. First of all, you know, it would be great for you guys to contact our office or whatever office that you're in that area, because it might be not something we don't know about. And then we can help deal with the issue or help the landowner. We do have, because this was such a common thing that was occurring, we do have a sign now that says fishing is allowed, but no hunting, you know, additional other activities that we can supply with the landowner with. I guess for me, safety first. You know, maybe pick a different spot and let us know where that no trespassing sign is. But you know, if it's in the map book, we don't really have any mistakes in there. So if it's in there, hopefully you're at the right bridge. But it might just be an issue with the landowner maybe isn't aware of it. So if you have land that changes hands and they weren't aware there's an easement on that property, they might be posting it, not really knowing.
And I think too, it's good to remember in a lot of those streams, you know, they wind all over the place. So you might have a pasture that's got, you know, 3,000 feet of stream going around the pasture. Just because there's an easement on that whole section does not give you the right to cut across that pasture. You have to
Correct.
stay
Yeah.
within that easement zone of, what is it, 66 feet from the stream center?
66 feet. Yeah, that's a weird number, but it's a rod. So, and like I said, kind of most of our streams, you know, it goes from the center of the stream out. So it gives you like 40 to 50 feet on the bank. So yeah, you can't just, you know, walk all over willy-nilly unless you're on state land. So
Yeah. So be respectful to private landowners, and if you have any questions, reach out to the area office. So Wesley asked, why stock fingerlings instead of adult fish? Is there a bioload issue or survivability issue?
well, cost is one of them. So, you know, the hatchery is paying to feed these fish and grow them to certain sizes. There's even a smaller size. They used to stock fry or frylings, and those were found to just not have good survivability. So the fingerling size seems to be the best, kind of in the middle, cost effective. We do understand not everyone's going to survive, but it seems to be the best. We've done some studies to kind of look at that, the survivability. The other thing, if you're stocking a 2 or 3-year-old adult and they're only surviving 3 to 4 years, you put a lot of effort into, potentially a year or two that those fish are going to be surviving on average. So,
Should get the most benefit we can for the money we have to spend, I suppose. So,
yep.
Sam and Michael both had real similar questions here, but heard a lot about the different things about physical characteristics of brook trout relative to genetics. Is there anything that an angler can identify a certain genetic strain of brook trout? Have you ever been able to tell if we catch the new strain?
Yeah, not that we know. No, I think it's a pretty hard no. The only case would be at times we also have to reduce the numbers of brood stock we have, or they're getting to the end of their reproductive, production. So we do have times where the hatchery will say, "Hey, we got some 3, 4-year-olds that we could stock." You'd maybe be able to tell those just because they've been living in a more confined space and they kind of get a little more beat up than when they're out in the wild. But when they're stocked as fingerlings, that'd be pretty hard to tell unless somehow we've clipped them for like an assessment.
Michael was wondering, will the heritage brook trout hybridize with a hatchery fish?
What, can you repeat that?
Will the heritage brook trout, the new species, hybridize with the hatchery fish we've
Well,
released in
that's
the
why,
past?
yeah, that's why we're gonna avoid stocking anywhere near those heritage streams. We really don't want to have mixing of, what we believe are these heritage or native populations with this other strain. Something I didn't mention was the Minnesota Driftless strain is now, the brood stock are from 3 different streams. So we've utilized 3 of our heritage populations to create those brood stock. So at times the hatchery could cross 2 different streams. So you're gonna end up, kind of mixing to get enough genetic variability. So we really just don't want to be stocking anywhere near any of those heritage streams. So hopefully not. But if we did stock them on top of like the Minnesota wild, I mean, they could definitely reproduce with one another.
That was a terrific answer because you asked Wesley's question about, was the driftless breed used to increase genetic variability, which you just alluded to from those 3 streams you took to get the best genetics you could from that. So.
Yep, and we'll continue to do that. We're still trying to identify potential donor streams to make sure that even as we're continuing to build the brood stock, that we continue to add genetic variability to those. So it's still a big work in progress.
It always is. We just got a couple minutes left. Carrie had a good question here. Will the driftless strain be shared with other states that overlap the driftless area for their stocking efforts?
Not at this point, but something I didn't mention is that we're not just stocking these in Southeast Minnesota. So I know Duluth, Little Falls, East and West Metro, they've requested these as well. So they're available to any area office statewide. Southeast and kind of the Northeast have the most trout streams. So that's where most of these fish, I'm assuming, are going. But yeah, we haven't done anything outstate. We have been coordinating with Iowa because they have identified a stream that they're using to repopulate some of their streams, and it is very closely related genetically to one of our heritage watersheds that's further down closer to Iowa. And so it kind of confirmed some of what they were finding. And they are not bringing those into a hatchery, but rather they're doing direct transfers. So, and then I know Wisconsin has some efforts that are going on their own. So kind of each states are kind of doing their own thing, staying within their own waters, but we are coordinating on, some of the ideas that each of our different groups are working on.
Great. And here, the one question we always get as anglers, we never want to share our hot spots, but we always get this question every time we talk about trout, is the best area for trout fishing near the Twin Cities, because I've never caught a trout. So you want
There's
to
a lot.
share your favorite spot?
Near the Twin Cities, you got, the Whitewater's a beautiful area. We have the Whitewater State Park. There's a lot of state land, so the Whitewater WMA is very large. There's 5 or 6 different streams that go through that area. So a lot of opportunities there, lots of different spots to hop on a
I
stream.
know, maybe correct me if I'm wrong too, but I think the Vermilion River down
Yep,
in the
that's
Farmington
that's
area
the
flows through it.
closest. Yep. Yeah.
That's probably the closest
Yep.
designated trout stream to a metro area, at least in the upper Midwest that I know of.
Yeah. Hay Creek is
So,
another one. That one flows into Red Wing, and we have
yep.
a lot of fishing easements along there as well. We've done quite a few habitat improvement projects, which make it, easier to access and fish. So it might be another one.
Some good options for you, as always. Our local Minnesota Trout Unlimited chapters, the Twin Cities chapter, the Windcrest down southeast, all of them across the state are fantastic. So reach out to them on their website too, and see if you can maybe get somebody to take you along and show you the ropes a little bit about trout fishing. It's a great sport to get into. So David says, thank you for answering our questions. Eric said, this is a good one too. We fish for we're with flies a lot for trout, but Eric wanted to know, would you assume that there's a certain level of brown on brook trout predation?
Brown on brook trout. They're definitely in competition with one another, but there's
Big
also
trout do
brown
eat
on
small
brown
trout.
predation. Yeah, it's more a size thing, I think, than anything. A fun story that maybe to end with was and kind of alludes to the survivability of some of these fingerlings. I helped stock some brown trout fingerlings one day on a Friday and ran into someone who worked at a golf course right along the same river. And he's like, you'll never believe what I caught. This is the very next day. Never believe what I caught earlier this morning. He said, I caught this 9-inch brown trout and it looked like it swallowed a golf ball. I'm like, well, you got my interest, because that'd be pretty crazy if a 9-inch brown trout swallowed a golf ball. And he said, so we kept it, and then we ended up checking the stomach to see what was in there, and there was 44 brown trout fingerlings inside of it. The 9-inch brown trout ate. And I said, were you fishing the golf course? And knowing that I had just stocked right through that area. And he said, yeah. And so that was that. Yeah. So they definitely, they'll eat whatever's kind of available to them. So that, but.
Yep. Great. We are just at 1 o'clock now. So just want to, Melissa, thank you for joining us and sharing all this great knowledge with us, and hope everybody ramped up a little bit. Trout season just opened this past Saturday, and it's shaping up to be a great year. Hope everybody can join us next week for episode 161. We're talking about warblers, experiencing the warbler migration. So how to get out and see these cool little birds and how to identify them. Amy Dean is going to join us and talk about that. So until next week, everybody stay safe, have fun outdoors, and we'll see you next week.